we from Statec took the opportunity of this conference to launch today our new report on well-being. And so we start with locals, and Stefano Bartolini sitting next to me. He will then be presenting the more academic side of, but we start with the locals with a practical approach on what we call PIBien-etre, which is contraction of words of GDP and well-being. It's like GDP well-being. So the idea is that you have on the one side the very well-known indicators with this GDP, and then you have well-being on the other side. So contracting water and fire. So the outline of my presentation is a brief history. I think it's interesting, and it will feed perhaps our discussion, our policy discussions later on, which is the project called PIBien-etre, this well-being project in Luxembourg. And I'll say something about the Luxembourg Index of Well-being. And we started a new survey on a quarterly survey on well-being. So I will say some words about it. And in the report, which will be published in an hour or so, there are some more studies in it on dissatisfaction in life and work. And then a new presentation, a different approach on what's called the efficiency of well-being. So the name is not from me; it comes from Francesco and Kelsey. So it's a new approach. And I finish by challenges of a well-being dashboard. So how to make this relevant for policy. So I start. I get it. Okay, so on the history, it started, of course, with this famous report. No, it started with actually with the work by the OECD. Many of you don't perhaps remember, but OECD started a very big project on the progress of societies. It was at the time of Enrico Giovannini, who launched this, and there was a big conference in Palermo, which was the starting point. And then he had this very famous reports by Stiglitz and Fitoussi, which has been presented at the Sorbonne by President Sarkozy. I was there, that's the reason why I mentioned it. It was really, it was a huge launch of this new approach on measuring well-being, and which has, I think, a lot of very important consequences. And then the government in 2009 decided that Luxembourg should have such a well-being index or a dashboard on well-being. And the government asked what we call here the Conseil économique et social. It's an institution that exists in various countries, which is the parliament of the social partners. So you have it in Italy, you have it in the Benelux countries, you have it in France. There's a lot of countries who have this social and economic board, and which was mission to discuss and to come up with a list of such indicators of well-being. And then much later came the first report. It was in 2017. Now today we will launch the third report on well-being, which will be on our website in an hour or so. It took some time before it could be launched, the first report, simply because social partners had some difficulties, plus environmentalists had some difficulties to find a compromise on which indicators should be taken. And unfortunately, we had a big recession coming from the international banking and financial crisis, which in Europe ended up in what has been called improperly, but still it's a crisis of the euro crisis. and social partners were torn apart, and it was quite difficult to find a consensus on which indicator should be decided upon. So it takes some time, and also we started in time. Our reports have been published quite late. So I give a small overview on what we have termed the Luxembourg Index of Well-being. So in the beginning, we had about 63 indicators which had been decided by social partners. But it turned out that many of those indicators were not available, or not available every year or even every 2 years. Many of them were there for more political reasons, but are statistically not really meaningful. And so we took the decision to go back to the authors of the list of indicators, so to the Conseil économique et social and to the counterpart, which are the Council of Environmentalists. And we propose them to take only the indicators which are available quickly and where we can assure the statistical quality. So it boiled down from 63 indicators to 21, but which made it manageable to produce such an indicator. So you see, I will not go to the whole list, but you see it's a different domain. It's income and wealth, employment, housing, health, life balance, education, social relationships, government and civic engagement, environment, and personal security. So, and for each of those domains, we have 2 or 3 indicators available. Now, if you go quickly through the indicators, we see that we have some where we have an improvement over the last 10 years. For example, education, by the increase of the share of adults with tertiary attainment, high rate of confidence in institutions, which is high and still goes up, improvement of life balance, and then the decrease of exposure to air pollution and particulate matter. And you have some where it has been worsening. So the employment, especially during the COVID-19 crisis, then personal security, we have an increase in the number of offenses, and then housing, which is measured by the part of the expenses for housing. It's a problem which is worsening here in Luxembourg. Now, the interesting thing is, it's of course interesting to look at the indicators one by one, and we have more of them on our website, of course. But it's very difficult to communicate. So what we did is to create a synthetic indicator, the famous, we call it famous, it's the Luxembourg indicator of wealth. Which is the LIV. And that has a big advantage that you can compare it more easily with GDP, because GDP is an aggregate. It's a synthetic indicators of all kinds of things, the value added of all kinds of activities which are put together. And it's a nice way of showing how on the one side, what we can call the quality of life on the one side, on the other side, the evolution of GDP or GNI by capita. And of course, what is striking, and you find it, I think, in the literature quite often, if you compare GDP or GDP per head on the one side, on the other side, some indicators of quality. And what you see, it's the yellow line. The yellow line, of course, is flatter. It went down after the financial and banking crisis and the euro crisis. It went down, and then it improved in the later years, but still it's flattening. The interesting thing is that 2020, which was the pandemic crisis, we don't see a degradation of well-being. And of course, this is quite compelling because the curve on GDP per head is steeper than the one of well-being. And one of interpretation, but of course there's a lot of things to say here. But the minister yesterday asked the question: "What is a good growth? What's a good development?" And our answer has always been: good growth is when you have the index of well-being, which is increasing as fast as the GDP per head, or even faster. One of the big problems of this kind of work, and probably we can discuss this at our roundtable, one of the big problems is that, of course, indicators are not available as quickly as we want them to be. And so we make a sub-selection of the indicators which are available also for 2021, so last year, because now we are in May, June, so 22. So it's important to know what happened in 21. But of course, the number of indicators will be the set which will be much smaller. So, for example, we saw that since 2020, so at the end of the pandemic, you see that there is a decrease in unemployment, forced part-time, and you have people unable to make ends meet, which decreased. And on the other side, indicators of the employment rate, tertiary education, adult training, people in good health, life expectancy went up. Greenhouse emissions increased also because it's quite correlated with economic growth. But you see then when you take a subset of indicators which are available quickly, of course you have much less of those. During the pandemic, we were, of course, one of our big problems was that indicators were not available quickly enough, and since we were in a very unusual situation, there were a lot of questions by the civil society, by politicians, by government, to know what's going on, how do people feel about the situation. And so we started a survey. Actually, we added questions on well-being on a quarterly basis, on subjective well-being, and so we could follow the subjective perception of well-being, and so we distinguished anxiety, loneliness, dissatisfaction with life, and pessimism about the future. And this is quarterly data. It's quite experimental because there is a quarterly shape in it, and which is difficult to interpret after having only five quarters. But if you take the two first quarters, so the yellow and blue, which is still very impacted by the pandemic, you see that we should expect that anxiety went down, but actually during the quarters, the next quarters, anxiety went up. Loneliness decreased over the quarters, which is, I think, a positive evolution. The same for dissatisfaction. But on the other side, pessimism went up. So we have now more, we try now to set up quarterly data just to answer this need to have data which are as actual as possible. In the report, there are some studies which have been added, so making some analysis of the data, mainly microdata, which are available. So I wanted to go to say something about life dissatisfaction, work dissatisfaction, and efficient well-being. So dissatisfaction with life. So we took, instead of talking about satisfaction, we took those at the end of the distribution, so those who are dissatisfied with life. And the interesting analysis is that here we made a panel analysis on the waves of the EU Silk database, where satisfaction is studied from 2016 to 2020. So it's a panel analysis. It's interesting to see to what extent that the determinants we are used to survive in such an analysis. And fortunately, we found we have the results of the regression analysis. So it's a panel logit. And so you see that the high levels of dissatisfaction is explained by pollution, education. So you feel less dissatisfied when you have higher educational degree. Nationality, foreigners are more dissatisfied than the nationals. Unemployment are more dissatisfied. So it's over the period. So it's interesting to see how robust that the determinants remain when you look in a longitudinal perspective. Financial difficulties make you less satisfied. And then, of course, health, it's a very important variable where, of course, bad health contributes to dissatisfaction. So I think it was important to have this, to make some analysis on the data that we have accumulated through the EU Silk survey on satisfaction. Another analysis is about the dissatisfaction at work. Fortunately, is decreasing since 2018. So we have in 2021, we have about 14% of people claiming that they are dissatisfied with their job. And there too, we went for some econometrics, and so we can see that dissatisfaction is not with the nationals, but it's the foreigners, people doing shift work, or people with a tenure of more than 10 years, while all the other variables don't seem to have have no significant importance. A third study is about efficient well-being. So it's a little bit cumbersome to speak about efficiency of well-being. So, but I think that Francesco and Kelsey will think about how to reformulate this in a more positive way. But the idea is that it indicates how well countries transform input into subjective well-being. So we are endowed with some resources, income, health, etc. And how good are we? How is our aptitude to transform these advantages into well-being? So it's a kind of technology of well-being, and the approach is one of data development. So you look at what happens at the frontier, and all the countries are then reclassified. And the interesting thing is that still concerning Luxembourg, we are still, even after all these corrections, we are still at a high level. But the study shows that we could be happier if we were able to use the resource we have better. So we should, with all we have, we should be able to be better off, at least in the perceived feeling of at least we should be more satisfied. So this is one of the very traditional results when you classify GDP per head and the satisfaction. As you see that all the countries are around this non-linear curve, and Luxembourg is a kind of an exception. So despite the high level of GDP, we are not happy enough compared to the income that we have. The interesting thing too is even if you change, if you take this new measure, well-being efficiency, you see that, and you make the correlation, you see that this well-being efficiency, so the capacity to transform your resources into satisfaction, it's correlated with higher GDP per capita, higher social support, and higher healthy life expectancy. So we have a kind of cross-validation that these indicators are saying something interesting. I come now to my last, who checks the time? I'm in time still? Okay, so this is what we find in our report, but now I wanted to share some thoughts on what are the problems, because we are not only here to make some marketing of how well the Luxembourg fares and how wealthy and how well we feel, but I wanted to share some insights from our project. So I call this the Pitfalls. And for having some experience with this project now, I can tell you the first one is about communication. So making well-being indicators as popular and regarded as GDP, inflation, employment. So the kind of indicators you find every day on the media. And nobody talks or rarely about well-being. So I think, but we can debate this later on, one of the aims should be that it has at the height, that we put well-being indicators at the level of the traditional indicators, so to bring this in the public debate at the same level as the traditional indicators. And I can tell you, there's a long way to go. So then there is a statistics pitfall, which is well-being indicators are lagging behind. I showed you that if you want to have indicators which are as recent as possible, we have to drop many of them. And still, yeah, in 21. So I would like to say something about 22, because today people want to know what's happening now. What happened yesterday? I don't really care. What happens today and tomorrow? And so if we tell them what happened in 21, it's interesting for our circles, but I'm not sure that that citizens and politicians are really interested in it. So we have to find a way to nowcast this data to make sure that we have some interesting indicators that we could use at year T, so or even at the quarter where we are discussing. Then the dashboard it's a great idea. And I told you, social partners, they were very keen, and they find 63 indicators. So who will look at 63 indicators? It's impossible to grasp. It's impossible to understand, because some are going up, some are going down. So how can you draw some message out of it? So the dashboard's too many indicators. And so the question is, how many indicators are enough? So we imagine these synthetic indicators to mimic GDP. So that's the Luxembourg Index of Well-being, which is very useful, but of course shrinks the information, because then you have one number for reality which is multidimensional. And so you are just collapsing into one number as GDP, in one number, an indicator which should reflect what's going on in society. Then there is this numeracy. We worked a lot on trust in statistics and things like this. And one of the evidence is that numeracy in the general population is quite low. The people don't understand, even GDPs, they don't understand. Even inflation, we are talking about purchasing power. It's a complicated concept for normal citizens. So why should they understand the live? Why should they understand what's well-being? Then perception, subjective well-being is, of course, well received in these circles. There are so many loads of very interesting studies, and we all believe that this is true and real. But I made the experience that, for example, policymakers, they don't believe in it. They say, what is subjective? So that's a feeling. I want objective indicators. We had this discussion at government level with guys who are doing public policies, budgetary policy, etc. They don't take it. And the last one I wanted to say, very often in the discussions, there is this, I call it the GDP bashing. So GDP is the worst thing in the world, so you should scrap it, you should put it away, etc. I'm the head of the Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies, so I believe that national accounts have a lot to say. There is a lot of interesting information there. You should not scrap it, you should not put it away. And if you look at many of the studies, GDP or GNI are still a significant determinant of many of the well-being studies. So we should avoid to throw away which has a big value, for example, national accounts. So now the minister, we had a discussion yesterday and he initiated this discussion here. We are lagging behind as a country because we started early, then we got stuck somewhere. And many other countries were able to make the indicators part of the public debate. So we quoted Italy and France. Of course, it's debatable if it is really progress, but it is progress compared to what we do in Luxembourg. Of course, there are very good examples like New Zealand. That's for us a target. And I don't know if there are colleagues from New Zealand among us, because that would be interesting, or having a very similar experience. And then for Luxembourg, that is exactly what we will discuss at the round table. Because now for Luxembourg, we will face the next steps on how to make out of this project of PIBien-etre, how to make it valuable for public policies. Thank you very much. So questions?
Thank you, Serge. Catherine Scrivens from the OECD. I just wanted to ask, because I was very interested. Can you hear me? Yeah. I was very interested by the Minister of Economy's words yesterday, and he indicated that there have been some discussions to use the index in budgets, like some very initial discussions. Are you able to talk a little bit more in detail about what's going on there?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. I think it's the way forward. It's linking GDP with well-being. That's the way forward. And probably you have to start by what could be efficient and inefficient in understanding these relations, these two apparently separate concepts of GDP and well-being. And I think it's a very fruitful way to understand the efficiency and inefficiency of both concepts. My question is about, do you think that this is possible with the dashboard that we are proposing, the 16 indicators? Thank you.
Thanks, Serge. That was great. I was wondering if you could just say a few words on the harvesting of the data, how you're collecting it, because if you're collecting it quarterly, you know, that's obviously pretty regularly. So how are you you know, what's the methodology for gathering the data from the citizens? Thanks.
Thank you for the very interesting, a very lucid talk. Is this coming through the mic? Yes. I suppose the UK experience is that to influence policy, you probably need a very small number of indicators, well-being indicators. And I would like to think that our country has had some success in measuring life satisfaction and measuring happiness and worthwhileness of life. So you can track those through time. And of course, if you have a whole panoply, a whole set of different indicators, you don't know how to weight them. In GDP, we multiply by prices, of course, to produce an aggregate. And unless you rely on human feelings to do the aggregation, I don't know how you should do that. So I wonder if Luxembourg would like to produce a regular life satisfaction index and report it to the politicians.
Thank you. No other question? So I start with yeah, it takes one by one. So the budgetary question. Yes, the minister makes some allusion to this because that's what we call the second chapter of this PIBien-etre project. Because for the moment, you see, we struggle to have those indicators and we produce them. Very interesting. You will see in the media tomorrow, everybody will speak about it, and but it will be only one day. So the idea was how to institutionalize it. So how to make sure that it will be used when we have the budgetary discussion, which starts in October normally, and how to make sure that it is present, that the parliament will discuss it, that we will compare policies decided. Do they influence positively the dashboard or the well-being index? Those discussions have started, but it started already a year ago, and they were not really fruitful. But now context is a little bit better, so probably there will be discussion, and we will make a conference or workshop asking all those who have good practices, good experience, and how to make sure that those indicators can be used in policy making. And so I would like to answer I would like to know how the UK did it. And the big question is life satisfaction, which is subjective. So the aggregation is done by the citizens, by their feelings. So it's kind of the utility function. And this decision has still to be taken, but because I told you, many of them don't buy the subjective thing. They don't believe in it. And this is a big problem in the academia. There is now so many studies showing that there is some from Easterly on and all those who have contributed to it. So we have a big body of knowledge about it, that there is some strong consistency in those data, but still policymakers, at least in our country and no others, who don't buy it. Everywhere, says Professor Bartolini. So we have to discuss this kind of things, and probably there will be a compromise. As usual, we have the objective indicator, we have subjective, etc. But for example, the Minister of Finance said, okay, but well-being, we are interested in the well-being of companies, of banks. How well do they feel? So we come in discussion of competitiveness, of profitability, etc. So you see, interesting debate. Then the question on the dashboard, as I told you, of course, it's right. And that's my aim. I produce GDP, national accounts, and I want to have the alternative, call it alternative well-being indicators, as high in the priorities of decision makers as GDP. But GDP has 70 years of development, so, and well-being we started not very long ago. So But for the moment, I don't believe that the dashboard is the right answer, because too many indicators, it's impossible to grasp. On the quarterly, the question on the quarterly data, I call it experimental data because we don't have now experience with it. We don't even understand for the moment the shape of the evolution. And so we need some more time to have some kind of time series. It's microdata, so but to understand what's the information which is in those data. But it's simply, we have added question to a survey, which is quite dull. We do for administrative purposes, which is a survey on tourism. And so we added questions on well-being. And because there is a strong need to understand subjective well-being on more frequent approach. Okay, so I don't want to go deeper in it because there is Stefano who is because I wanted to keep the questions and for the debate afterwards, because I think we can deepen a lot of things there. So I don't want to prejudge everything which will come out of this discussion, if you agree. And so you have more time for your presentation.